The autumn of 1963 found Vienna existing in a state of suspended disbelief. The city, partitioned and then neutralized by the 1955 State Treaty, was ostensibly a beacon of independence, a bridge between two worlds. In reality, it was a pressurized chamber. The grand facades of the Ringstrasse, the opulent coffee houses, and the hallowed halls of the Staatsoper provided a civilized veneer over a frantic, subcutaneous network of espionage. Vienna was not divided by a wall like Berlin, but by invisible lines of allegiance, observation, and betrayal that crisscrossed every cobblestone square. Into this environment, Arthur Holloway, 52, had settled with the weary comfort of a professional. His official cover was that of First Secretary for Cultural Affairs at the British Embassy. It was a plausible, if dull, identity, allowing him to navigate the city's artistic circles, attend receptions, and facilitate academic exchanges. His true function, known only to a handful in London, was head of station, Vienna, for the Secret Intelligence Service, or MI6. Holloway was a man defined by a receding hairline, meticulously tailored, if slightly outdated suits, and an abiding loneliness that he had long ago mistaken for professional detachment. He was a product of the old service, recruited from Cambridge, hardened by wartime work in signals intelligence, and now serving out what he assumed would be the final decade of his career in this gray, elegant, and paranoid city. His job was not one of thrills, but of patient, painstaking cultivation. He managed assets, cross-referenced reports on Soviet troop movements in Hungary, and analyzed the cryptic moods of the Czech and Polish missions. His life was a series of compartments: his secure flat, his sanitized office at the embassy, and the network of safe houses and dead-drop locations he maintained with obsessive precision. He found solace in the routine, the morning Einspänner at the Café Landmann, the precise fold of Die Presse, the coded signals exchanged through classified advertisements. The other side of this equation was Major Dmitry Volkov, a new, unsettling presence at the Soviet Residentura operating from the vast complex under the guise of the TASS news agency. Volkov was not a product of the old, brutish NKVD. He was younger, sharper, a graduate of the KGB's new psychological warfare school. He saw Vienna not as a battlefield, but as a laboratory. He was patient. He understood that ideology was a blunt instrument. The truly effective weapon was human frailty. Volkov had spent his first 2 months in Vienna simply observing, mapping the city's networks, and looking for the hairline fractures in the western facade. And then there was Lara Vogel. At 24, she was a corps de ballet dancer at the Vienna State Opera, possessed of a talent that was just beginning to isolate her, demanding sacrifices she was not yet sure she was willing to make. She was Austrian, born in the lean years after the war, and possessed an apolitical intensity focused entirely on her art. She lived in a small, damp apartment with her aunt and moved through the city with a dancer's specific contained grace. She was aware, as all Viennese were, of the shadows, but she viewed the political maneuverings with the same disinterest she held for banal gossip. Her world was the bar, the Rosanne, and the unforgiving judgment of the ballet master. She was, in the complex calculus of the city, a non-entity, which made her the most dangerous kind of variable. Arthur Holloway first saw her not as a person, but as an image, a fleeting moment of grace under the massive chandeliers of the Opera House during a state reception for a visiting British trade delegation. He was there to observe a junior Soviet trade attaché, but his eyes, tired of scanning for surveillance, settled on her. It was a momentary lapse, nothing more. Or so he told himself. The winter of 1963-64 descended on Vienna with a particular severity, encasing the city in ice and a thick, muffling fog. The atmosphere suited Holloway's professional anxieties. His best asset, a mid-level functionary in the Czechoslovakian trade mission codenamed Tallow, was becoming erratic. Tallow, who provided mundane but useful details on Comecon supply chains, had missed a scheduled brush pass and had signaled extreme distress using a pre-arranged emergency signal, a chalk mark on a specific post box. This was unusual. Tallow was a steady, reliable source, motivated less by ideology than by a need for hard Western currency to support a sick relative. Holloway's analysis suggested Tallow was not acting under duress. but reacting to it. The entire Czech mission, Holloway noted in a coded cable to London, seemed unusually agitated. This professional tension was the backdrop for his second, more formal encounter with Ilara Vogel. The British Council was sponsoring a new production of Swan Lake, and Holloway, in his cultural capacity, was obligated to host a small post-performance reception. He moved through the crowded room with practiced ease, exchanging pleasantries with Austrian ministry officials and their wives, his mind still cycling through contingency plans for tallow. He found Ilara near the buffet, looking slightly overwhelmed. She was not in costume, but in a simple black dress that seemed too thin for the weather. He introduced himself. "Mr. Holloway, British Embassy. A truly remarkable performance, Fräulein Vogel. Your solo in the second act was precise." She looked at him, surprised by the specificity. "Thank you, Herr Sekretär. You are a student of ballet?" "I am a student of discipline," Holloway replied, a rare, uncalculated truth. "The dedication required seems formidable." They spoke for 10 minutes. The conversation was banal, the challenges of the new choreography, the rumored retirement of the Kapellmeister. Yet, for Holloway, the interaction was deeply unsettling. He was trained to listen to the subtext, to the spaces between words. With Ilara, there was none. She was direct, unguarded, and possessed an earnestness he had not encountered in years. It felt like drinking clear, cold water after a decade of stale wine. He found himself wanting to protect that artlessness, a dangerous, unprofessional impulse. A week later, London sent a reply to his tallow concerns. The cable was routed through the secure diplomatic bag, a slow process that irritated him. The response was clinical, warning him against sentimental engagement with assets and reminding him of station's primary directive: observe and report, do not engage and rescue. Tucked into the administrative updates was a new protocol directive, a general warning to all European stations about honey traps, referencing a recent messy incident in Helsinki. Vulnerabilities of a personal nature remain the opposition's preferred vector, the cable read. Heads of station are reminded that fraternization with local nationals, particularly those with no clear intelligence value, constitutes an unacceptable security risk. Holloway read the directive, initialed it, and filed it. He told himself it was boilerplate, a routine warning. He did not, for a single moment, connect the ink on the page to the brief, warm conversation he'd had with a young ballet dancer. He compartmentalized. The tallow problem was a professional one. Ilara Vogel was a cultural contact. The two files in his mind remained separate. The discovery was not a single event, but a slow, creeping realization, a personal failure of tradecraft that Arthur Holloway, a man who prided himself on analytical detachment, walked into with his eyes wide open. He began to accidentally encounter Ilara. The first time, it was at the Café Mozart, where he knew the corps de ballet often went for coffee and apfelstrudel after rehearsals. He sat at his usual table, reading the Times, delivered 2 days late, and feigned surprise. "Fräulein Vogel, what a pleasant coincidence." She smiled, and that unguarded warmth again struck him. He invited her to his table. She spoke about the politics of the opera house, the jealousy of the other dancers, her simple desire to one day dance Giselle. He spoke carefully about growing up in Surrey, about his work promoting British artists. He rationalized these meetings. She was Austrian, a neutral citizen. She had no access to classified information. She was, in his professional assessment, clean. But the meetings became a habit. A coffee became a quiet dinner at a small guest house in the 8th District, far from the diplomatic scrutiny of the Innere Stadt. He found himself talking. He spoke of his wife, who had passed away 5 years prior, a personal detail he had never shared with any colleague. He spoke of his loneliness, masking it as professional stress. He was breaking every rule in the MI6 handbook. Do not form predictable patterns. Do not reveal personal history. Do not develop attachments. He was, in effect, running himself as an asset. The true discovery was his own vulnerability. He had spent 2 decades building walls, and a 24-year-old dancer had dismantled them in a matter of weeks, not through guile or manipulation, but by offering simple, uncomplicated human connection. The affair, when it began, was inevitable. It was not a passionate, cinematic event, but a quiet, almost hesitant easing of boundaries. It happened at his flat, the one place that should have been his fortress. He had invited her for a late supper after a performance, arguing to himself that it was safer than a hotel, less traceable. The security protocols he followed for his dead drops and safe house meets, the dry cleaning, the surveillance detection routes, the coded signals, he abandoned them all for her. He used his personal key. He let her past the doorman. He had compromised his own sanctuary. In the analytical part of his brain, a small, cold voice screamed warnings. He was 52, she was 24. He was a spy, she was a dancer. This was not a romance, it was a security breach. But the larger, emptier part of him silenced that voice. He needed this. He needed the warmth in the sterile apartment, the sound of laughter that wasn't coded, the physical contact that wasn't a brush pass in a crowded U-Bahn station. The true discovery was that Arthur Holloway, the meticulous head of station, was profoundly, deeply compromised, not by an enemy agent, but by his own profound need to not be alone. This, he realized one morning, watching her sleep as the gray Vienna dawn broke, was how it happened. This was the personal vulnerability London warned about. It wasn't a trap. It was a simple, human failing. And he knew with a sudden chilling certainty that it was a failing the other side would already be looking for. Major Dmitry Volkov did not believe in coincidence. He believed in patterns, pressures, and probabilities. His primary directive in Vienna was not to collect secrets. That was the GRU's clumsy domain, but to identify weaknesses. He was, in essence, a sociologist of his enemies. He had initiated a passive assessment of the entire British diplomatic mission, logging their routines, habits, and preferences. Arthur Holloway, the quiet cultural attaché, had been categorized as low priority, professional, stable. Then the pattern broke. Volkov's surveillance teams, a mix of KGB officers and locally hired Hilfswillige auxiliaries, noted the change. The reports from the Nightingale team, tasked with monitoring the Staatsoper as a potential source of compromise on Austrian officials, were the first to mention it. They had a long-range lens on Alara Vogel, initially flagging her as a potential access agent to a married government minister who was known to be a ballet enthusiast. But the minister lost interest, and the file on Vogel was about to be closed. Then, one of Volkov's watchers, a bored man named Pavel, sitting in a cold Fiat across from Café Mozart, snapped a photograph of Vogel sharing a table with Holloway. The photograph landed on Volkov's desk. It was an anomaly. Holloway, the stable professional, was meeting a dancer 30 years his junior. Volkov cross-referenced. Holloway had been at the opera reception. He had been seen at the Café Mozart 3 times in the last 2 weeks, always coinciding with Vogel's post-rehearsal schedule. "Activate full surveillance on Holloway," Volkov ordered, "and place a Swallow female agent close to Vogel." The operation was textbook. It was silent, patient, and multi-layered. A subtle technical operation was approved for Holloway's flat. While he was at a known hours-long diplomatic luncheon, a gray team, KGB Technical Services, entered his apartment. It was a high-risk move, but Volkov calculated that Holloway's arrogance in his own security would make him blind. They didn't bug the entire flat, just the bedroom. They installed a passive device, a high-frequency transmitter that was nearly undetectable. They also conducted a bag op, photographing the contents of his briefcase, his private ledger, and his diplomatic-coded address book. They found nothing directly incriminating, but the absence of high-security items, which he should have kept in an office safe, told Volkov that Holloway was using the flat for non-official and therefore insecure purposes. Simultaneously, Alara Vogel acquired a new friend. A dancer in the corps, a Bulgarian girl named Anna, had been on the KGB's payroll for a year, a sleeper waiting for a purpose. Anna was activated. She befriended Alara, offering a sympathetic ear. Alara, naive and excited by the attention of the older, sophisticated Englishman, confided in Anna. "He's so kind," she explained over coffee. "Very serious, but gentle. He works at the British Embassy." Anna, well-trained, asked innocent questions. "The embassy? That sounds so important. Is he a big diplomat?" I think so, Ilara said. He has a lovely large flat near the Stadtpark. Anna's reports, relayed to Volkov, confirmed the nature of the relationship. It was personal, not professional. It was, as Volkov noted in his file, the perfect vector. The surveillance was no longer passive. Holloway was now a designated target. The watchers took note of his increasingly sloppy tradecraft. He would leave the embassy and go straight to his flat without the required surveillance detection route. He missed the subtle signs, the flicker on his phone line, the unmarked delivery van parked on his street for 3 days straight, the fact that the doorman, usually taciturn, had suddenly become overly friendly, a sure sign he had been briefed by someone. Arthur Holloway was no longer a hunter. He was, quite thoroughly, the prey. The professional and the personal collapsed on a Tuesday. The day began with a devastating silent signal. Arthur Holloway went to check a dead drop intended for tallow, his Czech asset. The drop was cold. The signal chalk mark was absent, meaning tallow had not serviced it. This was bad, but what was worse was the interference signal he found 2 blocks away. A small red toy soldier placed deliberately in the grate of a specific storm drain. This was not their code. It was a Soviet code. It was a crude, deliberate sign of dominance, a message from Volkov's office directly to him. We were here first. We own your asset. Holloway felt a physical chill that had nothing to do with the damp February air. Tallow was gone, either recalled to Prague or, more likely, turned. The network he had spent 3 years building was not just compromised, it was being publicly dismantled. He walked for hours, trying to think, to analyze the breach. How? Had tallow been a plant all along? No, the intelligence had been too good, too verifiable. The breach was new. The breach his training screamed at him was him. He had been sloppy. The affair, the predictable patterns, the unsecured flat. He had led them to tallow, perhaps by bringing contaminated equipment home, or simply by being observed, lowering the station's entire security profile. He went to a public call box, his hands shaking slightly, and placed a call to a cutout number, a travel agency. "I'd like to inquire about the package to Lisbon," he said, his voice strained. "I'm afraid that package is no longer available." The voice on the other end replied. It was the correct countersign. He had just activated the station's emergency protocol. He was signaling to London that he was under extreme duress and that the station was compromised. That evening, he went to his flat. Ilara was already there. He had given her a key. This act, once a symbol of trust, now seemed like catastrophic negligence. She was humming, making a simple supper. The domesticity of the scene, contrasted with the ruin of his professional life, created a cognitive dissonance that manifested as a cold, quiet anger. "What did you do today?" he asked, his voice flat. "Rehearsal," she said, sensing his mood. It was terrible. Herr Kloss was in a foul temper. "Who else did you speak to?" "What do you mean, Arthur?" "The other dancers." "Anna." "Why?" "Anna," he repeated, "the Bulgarian dancer. The one Ilara had mentioned, the new friend." He felt the tumblers of the lock click into place. A new close friend, appearing just as the relationship began. He, the head of station, had failed to run a basic name check on his mistress's associates. "What did you tell Anna about me?" Ilara was confused, her eyes wide with fear at his tone. "Nothing. Just that you were kind, that you worked for the British." "Arthur, you're frightening me. Did you tell her where I lived?" She might have asked. Ilara whispered. I think she offered to drop off a costume one day. I told her it was near the Stadtpark. "Did she ever come here?" "No, of course not. Arthur, what is this?" The confrontation was not a loud argument, but a sterile, terrified interrogation. He grabbed her arm, his fingers gripping tightly. "You must never, ever speak to her again. You must not speak to anyone about me. Do you understand?" He saw the tears welling in her eyes, and for the first time, he saw her not as a comfort, but as a liability. The contamination was complete. He had imported the poison into his own sanctuary. The key event was this. The moment he looked at her, the person for whom he had risked everything, and felt only the cold calculus of damage control. He had to get her out, and then he had to run. But he knew, as he looked at the door, that it was already far too late. Holloway knew he had, at best, hours. His emergency cable to London would have triggered alarms, but a response, extraction or reinforcement, would take days. His only option was the E&E, escape and evasion plan, a route he himself had designed. It involved a train to Graz, a rendezvous with a forestry agent, and a discreet crossing over the Yugoslav border. It was a desperate, low-probability gambit. He needed his emergency cash, a false-bottomed briefcase in his study containing a different passport, Robert H. Wilkinson, a mining engineer, 50,000 Austrian shilling, and a one-time pad for a final burn message. He told Ilara to pack a small bag and wait for him at the Westbahnhof train station at 10 p.m. "If I am not there by 10:15, he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Take the train to Salzburg and do not stop. Go to your cousin. Forget you ever knew me." This, he knew, was a final, pathetic attempt at gallantry. She would be watched. He sent her out the service entrance. Then he began his own sanitization. He burned his private notebooks in the sink, turning the ashes to paste. He wiped every surface. He was methodical, his training kicking in, a cold calm settling over him. He was just reaching for the hidden compartment in his desk drawer, his hand brushing against the false-bottomed briefcase, when he heard a sound from the drawing room, a soft cough. He froze. He had not heard the door. He was a professional, and he had not heard the door. He rose slowly, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. Major Dmitry Volkov was sitting in Holloway's favorite wingback chair, a file resting on his lap. He was smoking one of Holloway's own English cigarettes, which he had taken from the silver box on the mantel. Standing by the door, perfectly still, were two men in ill-fitting heavy wool suits. They were not local thugs. They had the unmistakable inert confidence of Moscow-trained bodyguards. The room, his sanctuary, was perfectly violated. "Mr. Holloway," Volkov said, his English precise, with only a slight Slavic cadence. "Or perhaps Herr Holloway? You seem to be preparing for a trip. Please do not let us interrupt." The exposure was not violent. It was surgical. It was absolute. There was no shouting, no struggle. Holloway's mind was racing, calculating, but there were no moves left to make. He had been so focused on the asset, tallow, and the vector, Ilara, that he had missed the target, himself. "Volkov," Holloway acknowledged, his voice a dry rasp. "You've been thorough." "It is my job," Volkov said, gesturing to the chair opposite him. "Please, sit. Your guest, Fräulein Vogel. She seemed distressed. I had my men ensure she arrived at the Westbahnhof safely. A ticket to Salzburg has been arranged for her." Holloway's blood ran cold. They had her. Or at least they knew exactly where she was. This wasn't an arrest. He was a diplomat. They couldn't arrest him. This was something else. This was a conversation. "You have caused a great deal of trouble, Arthur," Volkov said, using his first name with a chilling familiarity. "My superiors are disappointed in your station's activities. Tallow, for instance. A very clumsy operation." Volkov opened the file. It was Holloway's own. Inside were photographs. Photographs of him and Ilara at the cafe, a long lens shot of them embracing in his flat, taken from the building opposite, a grainy, damning image of him accessing the tallow dead drop. "But," Volkov continued, closing the file with a soft snap, "my superiors are also practical. London is very far away. And this flat," he glanced around, "is very comfortable. We should talk about your future. And of course, the future of the very talented Fräulein Vogel." The hotel room in the title was metaphorical. The reality was his own drawing room, turned into an interrogation chamber, the KGB sitting in his chair, smoking his cigarettes. The checkmate was complete. The interrogation did not take place in a concrete bunker or a high-security prison. Volkov was too sophisticated for such theatrics. Holloway was politely and firmly invited to a secure dacha in the Vienna woods, a property technically owned by the Soviet Trade Mission. It was, for all intents and purposes, sovereign Soviet territory. His diplomatic immunity was a polite fiction that Volkov had no intention of honoring. The process lasted 72 hours. It was a masterpiece of psychological deconstruction. There was no physical intimidation. Instead, Holloway was subjected to the most debilitating weapon in the KGB arsenal: polite, relentless, bureaucratic reasonableness. He was given a comfortable room, but the light bulb was a specific, irritating wattage that made sleep difficult. His meals were regular but bland. He was never left alone. The two heavy-set men were his constant, silent companions. The interrogation itself was conducted by Volkov, who treated the entire affair like a regrettable but necessary audit. "Let us be clear, Arthur," Volkov began, offering him a cigarette. "Your career with the service is over. We have Tallow. We have his records. We have your protocols. We have photographs of your indiscretion. If you return to London, you will be debriefed, disgraced, and put out to pasture, if you are lucky. Given the recent Philby business, I suspect they will not be so lenient. They will assume you were turned long ago." Holloway, exhausted and disoriented, tried to hold on to his training. Name, rank, and serial number was the military ethos, but in this world, the only response was silence. Volkov preempted it. "Silence will not help her, Arthur. Fräulein Vogel. She is currently with the Austrian Staatspolizei. They are very interested in her association with a known foreign agent. We, of course, provided the anonymous tip. Such a talent. It would be a tragedy if she were to be labeled an associate of a British spy. Her career would be finished. She would never dance. She would, I imagine, be quite isolated." This was the lever. Volkov used Alara not as a threat, but as a shared concern. He positioned himself as Holloway's only ally. "You and I, Arthur, we are professionals. We understand the rules. She is a civilian and innocent. You brought her into this. I am offering you a way to get her out." The offer was simple. Holloway would not be a defector. That was too messy. He would become a controlled asset. He would return to the embassy, his E&E signal a false alarm, a moment of professional panic. He would feed London information provided by Volkov, high-level, verifiable intelligence, but ultimately useless, designed to mislead and confuse British analysis of Soviet intentions in Austria. In return, the file on Alara Vogel would be closed. The Staatspolizei would lose interest. She would be left alone. "Think of it, Arthur," Volkov said softly on the third day, as Holloway stared at the gray, unmoving trees outside the window. "You have lost everything: your network, your reputation, your future. I am offering you the chance to save one small part of it. The only part, I suspect, you still truly care about." Holloway looked at Volkov, the new polished face of the enemy. He saw no ideology, no malice. He saw only a man who had identified a weakness and applied pressure with surgical precision. The interrogation ended not with a confession, but with a quiet, exhausted, and utterly defeated nod. "What?" Holloway asked, his voice cracking. "Do you need me to do?" The immediate aftermath was a study in surreal, agonizing normalcy. Holloway was driven back to his flat by Volkov's men. The flat had been cleaned, not in the forensic sense, but in the psychological one. The ashtrays were empty. The chair was straightened. It was as if the confrontation had never happened. Holloway, functioning on pure reflex, went to the embassy. He filed a report stating that his extreme duress signal was a false alarm, a reaction to a provocative but ultimately harmless Soviet maneuver he had misinterpreted. He claimed Tallow had likely been withdrawn in a routine rotation. His colleagues, particularly his suspicious deputy head of station, looked at him with a new cold skepticism. He was the head of station, but he was now a pariah in his own office. The trust was gone. Holloway had become the walking embodiment of a security breach. His first task for Volkov was simple. He was to discover a file detailing Soviet communications protocols, which he was to heroically pass to London. The file was a plant, a sophisticated piece of disinformation designed to make MI6 believe they had insight into KGB codes, when in fact it would lead them away from the real breakthroughs. Holloway did as he was told. He felt a profound self-loathing, a hollowing out of his very identity. He was a shell, performing the duties of a British spy while serving a Soviet master. He tried to see Alara, but she was gone. As Volkov had promised, the Austrian police interviewed her for 6 hours, asking her about her relationship with Holloway, implying she was a political pawn. Terrified and humiliated, she was released. She promptly resigned from the Staatsoper, packed her bags, and took the train to Salzburg. She sent Holloway one letter, delivered to the embassy. It contained only 2 words: "Leave me." The emotional consequence was his complete isolation. The political consequence was the slow, systematic poisoning of the British intelligence well in Vienna. For Alara, the aftermath was a different kind of erasure. She had not been arrested, but she was marked. In the insular, gossipy world of Vienna, she was the spy's dancer. Doors closed, friends became scarce. The uncle of her friend Anna, the man who had asked such innocent questions, was never seen again. Alara eventually moved to Switzerland, married a quiet Zurich banker, and had 2 children. She never danced professionally again. She put away her pointe shoes and refused to speak of her time in Vienna. The passion that had defined her entire life had been extinguished, an accidental casualty in a war she never even knew she was near. The British embassy quietly recalled Holloway 6 months later, citing health reasons. His deputy had filed too many reports noting his erratic behavior and questionable judgment. London received him not as a returning hero, but as a failure. He was debriefed, and his handlers noted his lack of candor. They suspected he was burned out, perhaps even alcoholic. They never suspected he had been turned. Years passed. The Holloway case, as it was internally known, became a footnote in MI6 training manuals, an example of over-identification with station leading to professional burnout. Holloway was given a small windowless office at the back of the Foreign Office, tasked with translating archival German documents. It was a pension trap, a place for failed officers to wait out their time. He was watched, of course. His phone was monitored, his mail read. He was a person of interest to his own service, but they lacked the imagination to see the truth. They saw a man who had failed due to weakness. Volkov had seen a man who could be used because of that weakness. Holloway lived this gray half-life for 12 years, a ghost in his own country. He never remarried. He died of a sudden coronary thrombosis in 1975, alone in his small flat in Pimlico. His real work for Volkov had been minimal, but effective. He had confirmed the identities of 2 MI6 agents visiting Vienna, and had, in his most profound act of betrayal, provided the original E&E route plans for all British assets in Austria. Major Dmitry Volkov's career, by contrast, flourished. The successful turning of an MI6 head of station and the subsequent disinformation campaign was a model operation. It earned him a promotion to colonel and a prestigious post in Moscow, at the first Chief Directorate's headquarters in Yasenevo. He would go on to become a general, one of the architects of the KGB's psychological operations against NATO in the 1970s. He always remembered the Holloway case as his finest work, not because of the intelligence gained, but because of its elegance. No one was eliminated. No diplomatic incidents occurred. It was a simple, clean, psychological victory. Ilara Vogel's legacy was one of silence. To her children, she was simply a Swiss hausfrau who had a particular, strict posture, and who sometimes, when she thought no one was watching, would stand on her toes, a flicker of a forgotten life. When her husband passed away in the 1990s, a researcher working on a history of the Vienna State Opera contacted her. She declined to be interviewed. The file on Arthur Holloway, British spy, was officially declassified in London in 2015, but it was so heavily redacted as to be meaningless. The true story remained buried, known only to the dead and the archives of the now-defunct KGB. The legacy, ultimately, was not one of political shifts or captured secrets, but of 3 lives irrevoiced, a small human tragedy absorbed and forgotten by the vast, impersonal machinery of the Cold War. The case of Arthur Holloway serves as a definitive, if melancholy, case study in the methodology of the Cold War. It was a conflict waged not only with nuclear arsenals and ideological rhetoric, but with the quiet, persistent exploitation of human nature. Holloway was not a fool, nor was he an ideologue. He was not a traitor in the vein of a Philby, motivated by a competing belief system. He was simply a lonely man. His downfall was not orchestrated by a masterstroke of geopolitical strategy, but by a meticulous observation of his personal unmet needs. Major Volkov did not need to break down the door. He simply waited for Holloway to leave it unlocked. The mechanism of the affair was a classic application of compromising material, but with a sophisticated twist. Volkov recognized that the threat of exposing the affair was less powerful than the manipulation of the attachment itself. He didn't use the affair to blackmail Holloway. He used Holloway's genuine, if misguided, affection for Alara Vogel to rescue him. He offered him a path to redemption, a way to protect her, which was, in fact, the final binding chain of his servitude. Holloway's tragedy was not that he was compromised, but that he was compromised by his own better instincts, the desire for connection, the impulse to protect. This incident highlights the fundamental asymmetry of the conflict. The Western services, bound, however tenuously, by bureaucratic rules, diplomatic protocols, and a semblance of public morality, often found themselves at a disadvantage. Volkov, representing a system that viewed individuals, Holloway, Alara, Tallow, as mere components in a larger equation, was free to operate without such constraints. He weaponized loneliness, he weaponized kindness, he weaponized art. The presence of the KGB in Holloway's room was not the beginning of the end, it was a mere formality, the signing of a contract whose terms had been negotiated in quiet coffee houses and in the unguarded moments of a man's life. The true victor was not the Soviet Union, but the system itself, a paranoid, all-consuming apparatus that identified human warmth as a critical vulnerability and extinguished it with cold, analytical precision.